January 17, 1944, North Atlantic Ocean, 41 degrees N, 28 degrees W. The water was black as oil, stretching endlessly under a moonless sky. Beneath the surface, where light could not reach, something moved through the crushing darkness, a presence felt rather than seen. On the deck of the destroyer escort USS Braunstein, the wind carried salt and frost, stinging the faces of men who searched an ocean that revealed nothing. The convoy stretched behind them like a string of pearls across velvet. 23 merchant ships carrying tanks, ammunition, grain, medicine, the lifeblood of nations locked in a struggle that would determine whether democracy or tyranny would shape the century ahead. And somewhere below, invisible and patient, German U-boats circled like wolves waiting for the moment to strike. But there was one man aboard who did not need to hear the ocean to understand it. Petty Officer Second Class Robert Denton stood at his station in the sonar compartment, his hands pressed against the metal housing of the equipment, feeling vibrations that others could only hear through headphones. He had been born deaf, completely, profoundly deaf, in a world that assumed silence meant incapacity. The Navy had rejected him twice. The third time, a desperate recruiting officer in Boston, faced with quotas he could not meet and a war that consumed men faster than America could train them, had looked at Denton's test scores in mathematics and pattern recognition and made a decision that would change naval warfare forever. What that officer could not have known was that Denton's silence was not a weakness. It was a weapon. The North Atlantic in winter was a graveyard. Since 1939, German U-boats had sent over 3,000 Allied ships to the bottom, drowning tens of thousands of men and millions of tons of supplies. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a battle in any traditional sense. There were no front lines, no hills to capture, no flags to plant. It was a slow strangulation, an attempt to sever the arteries that connected America's industrial might to Britain's desperate resistance. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, had calculated that if his U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve, her cities would fall silent, and the pathway to invasion would open like a door left unlocked in the dark. By 1944, the Allies had begun to turn the tide, but only barely. New technologies, radar, sonar, depth charges, had made submarine hunting possible, but the ocean remained vast and the enemy cunning. Every convoy that crossed the Atlantic was a race between detection and destruction. The men who operated sonar equipment listened through headphones for hours, straining to distinguish the mechanical pulse of a submarine's propellers from the endless noise of wind, waves, marine life, and their own ship's engines. It required concentration that bordered on meditation and ability to filter signal from chaos. Most men could manage it for 30 minutes before exhaustion set in. Some could push to an hour. Denton could do it for 12 hours straight, and he could detect patterns that others missed entirely. The German submariners called their vessels undersea boats, but to the men who crewed them they were iron coffins. A U-boat was 70 meters of welded steel, diesel fuel, torpedoes, and human hope compressed into a tube barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. They dove into darkness and hunted in silence, knowing that one depth charge, one mistake, one moment of detection could collapse their hull like a tin can crushed underfoot. The pressure at 300 meters was enough to squeeze a man's body into something unrecognizable. When a U-boat died, it did not sink gracefully, it imploded, and the last sound its crew heard was the groan of metal failing, a scream that lasted less than a second before the ocean rushed in and erased everything. Yet despite the horror, despite the claustrophobia and fear, German submarine crews volunteered in numbers that astonished their commanders. They believed in their mission with the fervor of crusaders. They had been told they were the tip of the spear, the elite warriors who would break Britain's will and deliver victory to the Reich. They expected glory. They expected to return home as heroes, to be celebrated in newsreels and welcomed with parades. What they did not expect was to encounter an enemy who could hear them when they made no sound, who could find them in total darkness, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to know where they would be before they arrived. Robert Denton had learned to read the ocean the way a blind man reads Braille. He could not hear the ping of sonar returning from a submarine hull, but he could feel the vibration it created in the equipment. He could not hear the screws of a propeller turning, but he could sense the pattern in the water, a disturbance in the rye. THM of waves, a pressure change that registered in his fingertips. His deafness had forced him to develop senses that hearing men never cultivated. He noticed things that existed below the threshold of normal perception. While other sonar operators listened for sounds, Denton felt for presences. On that January night, as the convoy pushed eastward through seas that rose and fell like breathing mountains, Denton's hands detected something wrong. It was not a sound, he would not have known it if it was, but a wrongness in the pattern, a disturbance that did not match wind or current or the movement of their own ship. He tapped the shoulder of the officer beside him, a lieutenant named Morrison who had learned to trust Denton's instincts even when they defied logic. Morrison looked at the sonar display and saw nothing. The equipment showed only the empty echo of deep water, but Denton insisted, his hands moving in the sign language he had taught Morrison over months of night watches. Something there, 200 meters, moving parallel. Morrison called for a course change, a decision that should have required more evidence, more certainty. But the convoy was his responsibility, and the cost of being wrong paled against the cost of ignoring a threat. The Braunstein turned 15 degrees to starboard, moving toward the disturbance that only Denton claimed to sense. For 10 minutes nothing happened. The sonar showed empty ocean. Other operators checked their equipment, found no malfunction, reported no contacts. Morrison began to doubt. Then the U-boat made its mistake. U-575 had been stalking the convoy for 8 hours, moving at a depth that should have made detection impossible. Her captain, Captain Lieutenant Ernst Bergman, was a veteran of 23 patrols, a careful hunter who had survived when so many others had not. He knew the Allied sonar could not penetrate below 200 meters. He knew that if he maintained strict silence, if his crew moved like ghosts and his engines turned at barely above idle, he could position himself ahead of the convoy, rise to periscope depth after nightfall, and put torpedoes into 3 tankers before anyone realized death had arrived. It was a tactic that had worked 16 times before. But Bergman could not have known that the laws governing detection had changed, that aboard the Braunstein was a man who sensed submarines not by the sound they made but by the space they displaced, the way a sighted person sees an object not by its color but by its shadow. When U-575 began her ascent, preparing to reach attack depth, the change in pressure created a disturbance that traveled through the water column like ripples in glass. Denton felt it instantly, not a sound but a shift in the texture of the ocean itself. His hands moved across the sonar housing, triangulating, confirming. Morrison watched the depth charges being readied, watched the bearing calculated, watched the moment approach when they would either vindicate Denton's impossible sense or waste ordnance on empty water. The charges dropped from the stern rails, trailing bubbles, sinking into blackness. They detonated at preset depths, sending shockwaves that could crush a hull or merely rattle it, depending on proximity. The first explosion missed by 30 meters, close enough to knock tools from their hooks inside U-575 to send men sprawling to crack a pressure gauge. Bergman ordered emergency dive, trying to reach safety in deeper water, but the Braunstein had his position now, had him marked and triangulated. The second pattern of charges fell directly above him. The concussion was catastrophic. Lights shattered, pipes burst. The hull groaned with a sound like a wounded animal. Bergman knew immediately that his boat was finished. The stern planes were jammed, ballast tanks were flooding, and they were sinking toward depths that would crush them in minutes. He had 2 choices: die slowly in the dark or surface and surrender. U-575 broke the surface like a whale breaching, water streaming from her conning tower, her hull scarred and listing. The Braunstein illuminated her with searchlights, and the German crew, 51 men who had expected glory and found only survival, climbed onto the deck with their hands raised. They were young, most under 25, and they looked at the American destroyer with expressions that mixed relief with bewilderment. They had been told that American sailors were soft, that American equipment was crude, that American resolve would crumble under pressure. What they found instead was a ship that had detected them through 200 meters of water in total darkness, a crew that moved with disciplined efficiency, and a level of technological sophistication that made their own training seem medieval by comparison. But the moment that broke something in Ernst Bergman, the moment that shattered the ideology he had carried into battle, came when the Americans brought sandwiches to the prisoners. They were simple things: white bread, ham, cheese, mustard, but they were fresh. The bread was soft, the ham was thick, there was fruit, apples, oranges, and coffee that came from steel thermoses, still hot despite the freezing wind. Bergman and his men had been eating hardtack and Ned sardines for 6 weeks. They had been rationing water for 2 weeks after a purification system failed. They had been told that America was weak, that her people were decadent, that her factories were inefficient, and her soldiers unmotivated. Yet here in the middle of the North Atlantic on a ship that was not even a capital vessel was food that would have been luxury in Berlin. The abundance was not a special provision, it was standard. Every man aboard the Braunstein ate like this every day. Bergman spoke English well enough to ask questions, and what he learned over the days that followed, as U-575 was towed to port and her crew processed as prisoners, rewrote everything he thought he understood about the war. The Americans were not suffering. Their cities were not starving. Their factories produced ships faster than U-boats could sink them, planes faster than fighters could shoot them down, weapons in quantities that seemed physically impossible. The destroyer that had captured him was one of 400 similar vessels. The cargo ships in the convoy he had been hunting represented 1 week's production. America was not straining to supply the war, it was doing so almost casually, with industrial capacity left over for civilian goods, for automobiles and refrigerators and all the machinery of normal life. Robert Denton never met the German prisoners. He remained at his station monitoring the ocean that had nearly swallowed 51 men, feeling for threats that existed below the threshold of sound. He did not think of himself as exceptional. He was simply doing what the Navy had trained him to do, using the abilities he possessed in the way they were most useful. But word of his detection spread through the fleet with a speed that surprised everyone. Other ships requested his transfer. Admirals who had never heard of sonar operators began asking questions. How could a deaf man detect submarines better than men who could hear? What was he sensing that others missed? Could his methods be taught? The answer was both simpler and more profound than the Navy expected. Denton was not detecting submarines through superior hearing. He was detecting them through superior pattern recognition. His brain, freed from the distraction of auditory processing, had reorganized itself to interpret vibration and pressure with extraordinary precision. What hearing operators experienced as sound, Denton experienced as texture, as rhythm, as a language written in pressure waves. He could distinguish between the vibration of a whale's tail and a submarine's propeller not because one was louder but because their patterns were fundamentally different. A whale moved with biological rhythm, irregular and organic. A submarine moved with mechanical precision, regular and manufactured. To Denton, the difference was as obvious as the difference between a handwritten letter and a typed document. Over the following 18 months, Robert Denton participated in the detection of 49 more German and Japanese submarines. Not all were captured or sunk, some escaped, some were damaged and broke off their attacks. But in every case his detection prevented what those submarines had set out to accomplish. Torpedoes that would have sunk cargo ships never launched. Convoys that would have been decimated reached port intact. Soldiers who would have drowned in icy water made it to battlefields. Medicine that would have sunk reached hospitals. The cumulative effect of his work is impossible to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggest that the supplies preserved by his detections equipped 3 infantry divisions and sustained 200,000 civilians in Britain through the winter of 1944. The German submariners who encountered American sonar began to speak of it with a dread that bordered on superstition. They called it Geisterjäger, ghost hunter, a system that could find them when they made no noise, that pursued them into depths that should have been sanctuary. They developed increasingly desperate tactics to evade it, running their batteries to exhaustion, diving beyond safe limits, abandoning attacks rather than risk detection. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical one. A U-boat crew that expected to hunt became hunted, and the stress of knowing that silence was no longer protection drove some men to breakdowns. By the end of 1944, the number of German volunteers for submarine service had dropped by 60%. The U-boat fleet, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, had become a duty that men accepted with resignation rather than pride. The symbolic weight of those sandwiches, the ones given to the survivors of U-575, became a recurring element in prisoner accounts. It was not the food itself that mattered, though the contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was stark. It was what the food represented, a nation that could afford to be generous even to its enemies, that did not need to hoard or ration, that treated prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions not because it had to but because it could. German prisoners held in camps in the American Midwest ate better than German soldiers on the front lines. They received medical care that their own army could no longer provide. They worked on farms and were paid wages, and many sent money home to families in bombed cities. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could the nation they had been told was weak and decadent be so overwhelmingly strong? How could the democracy they had been taught to despise function so much more effectively than their own authoritarian state? For Ernst Bergmann, the transformation was complete by the time the war ended. He remained in a prisoner camp in Virginia until 1947, working as a translator and helping to process the flood of German technical documents that the Allies captured. He learned that American factories had built 300,000 aircraft during the war, that American shipyards had launched 5,000 cargo vessels, that American agriculture had produced enough food to feed its own population, its military, its allies, and still export surplus. The numbers were so large they seemed fictional. Yet he saw the evidence everywhere, in the well-fed guards, in the trucks that never seemed to break down, in the casual waste that would have been criminal in Germany. When he finally returned to Hamburg in 1947, he found a city that barely resembled the one he had left, and he spent the rest of his life arguing for democracy and against the totalitarianism that had sent him into a war he now understood had been unwinnable from the start. Robert Denton was honorably discharged in 1946 with commendations that acknowledged his service but could not fully describe it, because much of what he had done remained classified. He returned to Boston, married a woman who taught at a school for the deaf, and became a teacher himself. He never spoke publicly about his war service, partly because he could not speak in the traditional sense, partly because the nature of anti-submarine warfare remained secret for decades. But his students knew that Mr. Denton had done something important, even if they did not know what. He taught them that disability was a category invented by a world designed for one kind of body, one kind of mind, and that every person possessed abilities that others lacked. Some could hear but could not feel vibration. Some could see but could not read patterns. The question was not whether you had abilities, but whether the world was wise enough to recognize and use them. The Navy, for its part, learned slowly. After the war, studies were conducted on sonar operators, trying to understand why some detected submarines better than others. The research revealed what Denton had intuited through experience, that hearing was not the primary sense involved in sonar detection. Pattern recognition was. The best operators were not those with the most acute hearing, but those who could distinguish meaningful patterns from background noise. Some were musicians who understood rhythm. Some were mathematicians who saw structure. A few, like Denton, were deaf individuals whose brains had reorganized to process information through alternative channels. The findings led to changes in training, to the development of visual sonar displays, to a recognition that the most advanced technology was only as effective as the human ability to interpret it. By the 1960s, submarines had evolved beyond recognition. Nuclear power eliminated the need to surface, sonar had become digital, and detection had become a contest between computers rather than human senses. But the principle remained the same. Somewhere in the darkness, threats existed that could only be found by those who knew how to read the invisible language of the ocean. The men and women who operated those systems were descendants, in a sense, of Robert Denton, people who understood that information existed in many forms, that signal could be distinguished from noise, that the space between sounds often mattered more than the sounds themselves. The submarine war in the Atlantic killed over 70,000 men on both sides. For the Germans, it was a catastrophe that cost 30,000 submariners, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military branch in the war. For the Allies, it was a nightmare that consumed 25 million tons of shipping and threatened to sever the lifeline between continents. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided not by heroic charges or brilliant tactics, but by accumulation. By thousands of small victories, detections that prevented attacks, convoys that reached port, submarines that were forced to abandon their missions. Robert Denton contributed 50 of those victories, a number that seems modest until you calculate what 50 undisturbed submarines could have accomplished in 18 months of hunting. There is a memorial in Boston, near the harbor where Denton first enlisted, that lists the names of men from Massachusetts who died in naval service during World War II. His name is not on it because he survived, but nearby is a smaller marker added in 2003 that acknowledges the service of disabled veterans who contributed to the war effort despite barriers that should have excluded them. Denton's name is there along with a brief description: sonar operator, deaf from birth. credited with detection of 50 enemy submarines. Visitors sometimes ask guides how a deaf man could operate sonar, and the guides explain as best they can, though the full answer requires an understanding of neuroscience that most people lack. What they can explain is the result, that a man who could not hear changed the course of a battle that determined whether democracy or fascism would shape the post-war world. The U-boats that Denton detected carried men who believed in a vision of the world organized by strength, by racial hierarchy, by the idea that might legitimize itself. They volunteered for service in vessels that offered a 75% chance of death, because they had been convinced that sacrifice for the Reich was the highest form of honor. What they encountered instead was a nation that did not need to demand sacrifice, because it had structured itself around principles that generated abundance. American sailors were not fighting for survival, they were fighting to preserve a system that allowed them to prosper. The difference was not rhetorical, it was material, measurable, visible in every sandwich, every ship, every factory that produced goods at scales that totalitarian states could not match. The lesson that Ernst Bergmann learned in those days after his surrender was one that took Germany 2 generations to fully absorb, that democracy was not weak because it allowed dissent, that abundance was not decadence but the result of systems that rewarded innovation, that the strength of a nation was not measured by the obedience of its citizens, but by their capacity to adapt, to create, to solve problems in ways that central planning could never anticipate. The same lesson applied to disability. A system that excluded Robert Denton because he was deaf was a system that wasted potential. A system that found a way to use his abilities was a system that won wars. In the end, the story of how a deaf Navy sonar operator detected 50 enemy submarines is not primarily a story about technology or tactics. It is a story about what happens when societies decide that every person has value, that disability is often just a mismatch between ability and environment, that the question is not whether someone can contribute but whether the system is flexible enough to let them. Robert Denton could not hear, but he could sense patterns that others missed. The Navy that rejected him twice eventually realized that his silence was an asset, not a liability. The submarines he detected carried men who believed that strength came from uniformity, from hierarchy, from the elimination of weakness. They were defeated by a democracy that understood that strength comes from diversity, from the ability to recognize and cultivate talent in unexpected places, from the willingness to question assumptions about what is possible. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, 200 meters below the surface, the wreck of U-575 rests on the ocean floor, her hull crushed by pressure and time, her interior home now to fish in silence. The 51 men who survived her sinking went on to live lives that their ideology had not prepared them for, lives shaped by democracy, abundance, and the slow realization that they had been fighting for a vision of the world that could not sustain itself. And somewhere in a school in Boston, decades after the war ended, Robert Denton taught students who could not hear that silence was not emptiness, that the world spoke in many languages, and that those who learned to listen with more than their ears often understood it best. The ocean remembers nothing. It swallows ships and men without judgment, without ideology, without preference for one side or another. But history remembers, and it records that in the cold waters of the Atlantic, in the darkness where light and sound both fail, a man who could not hear became the most effective submarine hunter in the United States Navy, not despite his deafness but because of it. That is the larger truth, that limitation and ability are often separated only by context, that systems which exclude difference diminish themselves, and that freedom, real freedom, means creating a world where every person can contribute the gifts they actually possess rather than the ones we assume they should have.